Hello, everyone. You got to give me just a second because I have futzed something up on my end and I am hearing an echo really badly. So just give me a second so I can figure out where in the holy hell this echo is coming from. There it is. Got it. Echo killed. Okay, we're back in business. Sorry about that, guys. Sometimes I have so many screens open that I screw things up. It happens, it does. But guys, welcome to the show today. I've been looking forward to this show for a while. I'm really excited about it, and today we're going to have a great conversation with an amazing author and historian, my friend Dave Benner, about his new book that's about to be released in about a week and a half. It's called Thomas Paine, A Lifetime of Radicalism. I'm so looking forward to that. But before we bring Dave on and talk to you about what he's going on, I just want to plug a couple of things for you so that you guys know what's coming up. Now, as you know, on Tuesdays, this is not the last stream I do in the day. It is but the first stream I do in the day. And we always do nothing remotely controversial at 9:30 p.m. on Tuesdays. However, it's Trump announcement day, the biggest announcement, the best announcement. And so, what Joshua and I thought would be fun is that I'm going to go live with nothing remotely controversial, probably about 8:45 ish. And I'm going to be by myself because Joshua has to work. He has a schedule. And so I thought that we could watch the grand Trump announcement of him totally definitely not running for president, but probably running for president. I thought that we could watch that together at 9 p.m. tonight. And then Joshua will join us at 9:30 and we can do the show per usual. But instead of doing like a separate stream, I thought we would just combine both. So we'll be getting started a little bit earlier tonight for nothing remotely controversial. I hope you have the opportunity to join me for that. I think it's going to be great. Also, tomorrow, I have my old friend, Joseph Forcato, coming back to the channel. Joseph is a GOP strategist, really insightful about politics, just really kind of level-headed and nuanced, and doesn't do this crazy outrage clickbait stuff that so many commentators do. And I think he's just got a really good sense of what's going on in the world and where people are. And he is going to help me analyze why the Republicans lost in the midterms. Now, of course, you know why I think the Republicans got their asses handed to them in the midterms, and that was because of abortion. He may not agree with me. I'm not sure yet because I haven't actually asked him, but we're going to see what he thinks. He might have a different take on it. Who knows? But we always have a great conversation when Joseph comes on the channel, and I'm really looking forward to welcoming him tomorrow at 5 p.m. I think that's going to be great. Also, I got a couple things coming up in my locals community that I want to make sure you know about. This Sunday, 8 p.m., we are watching They Live with Rowdy Roddy Piper in my supporter Discord. Now, if you have never seen They Live, you need to come and watch They Live with us. They Live is one of possibly the greatest movies ever made. It is a classic. It is so relevant to our time. It is unbelievable. It has fun fact. They Live has the longest fight scene in the history of cinema. It has the longest fight scene ever in a single movie, and it is amazing. So please join us in the supporter Discord on Sunday at 8 p.m. and join us for movie night. It's going to be great. Now, I'll tell you how to get access to the supporter Discord in a minute, but one more thing I want to plug. Just because you guys know I don't like being controversial at all. I don't like being controversial. I'm very boring with my strategy. I never do things that purposefully trigger people or piss them off. And that's why we're reading the Unabomber Manifesto for book club coming up next month, Industrial Society and Its Future. I want to do a little bit of extremist book club, just for funs, for shits and giggles, you know. So if you have never read the Unabomber Manifesto, I've never read it either. And so this is going to be an experience for me. But we are going to be gathering in my community, whether you're a supporter on Locals or Patreon, for a discussion about that coming up on December 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. That is a Saturday, and I'm really looking forward to it, man. I've had, ever since I joined the Libertarians, this is one of the books, in addition to the 12 economics books I was given to read when I joined the party, that of course I never ended up reading. This is one of the things that they said, you have to read the Unabomber Manifesto, Carlin. He makes more sense than you think, and we'll see for ourselves, won't we? And we'll have a discussion about that on December 3rd. Now, how do you get access to this stuff? Well, I'm glad you asked. in order to get access to book club, in order to get access to the supporter Discord, in order to get access to the 2 Zoom calls that I do every single week with my supporter community, there are a couple things that you can do. Number one, you can sign up on my Patreon. You can find the link at activelyunwoke.com/support. You can also find it in the description below. Patreon has multiple levels of giving, anywhere from $5 a month all the way up to $250 a month, depending on what perks you want. You get all the perks for book club and Discord at the $5 a month level. Then there's additional stuff after that if you want. You can get some cool swag. You can get private calls with me, whatever you want. You can also sign up as a member of my Locals community. Locals is probably where I would recommend for the moment anyway, that people sign up if they have questions, or not if they have questions, but if they're just looking for a community. Listen, I had a lot of people on my stream yesterday. We welcomed actually a whole bunch of new members into my community. I really think my community is one of the most welcoming, kind of bad news bears types of like weird mishmash of people. And I say that with the utmost respect. We did a Zoom call last night where there were like 30 of us on this Zoom call up until midnight. And I was just like looking at all the different faces on the Zoom call. And all I was thinking was that if we had a person in a wheelchair, we would have like a perfect picture of diversity in my Locals community. We've got a little bit of everything. We've got young, we've got old, we have white, black, brown, whatever. We've got men, we've got women, we've got trans people, we've got non-binary, we've got like every picture of diversity in my Locals community, except for someone in a wheelchair. So if you're in a wheelchair, you definitely need to join so we can get the full paragon of diversity, and then we will never be canceled ever, and it'll be great. So you can get access to all this by becoming a member in Locals or Patreon, whatever's clever, whatever works for you. So let's get into my guest of the day. Mr. Dave Benner is the author of several books, but his latest one, Thomas Paine, A Lifetime of Radicalism. I just want to read you a paragraph from the introduction to introduce this. And by the way, guys, I do have Dave's website both linked in the pinned comment at the top of the chat, also in the description below. And I just want to read you this little paragraph. While he is recognized most as the author of Common Sense, the most influential tract calling for American independence, Paine's entire life was a tenure of political zealotry, during which he had a hand in virtually every momentous event of his time. His compelling defense of natural rights, constitutional government, hard money, the absolute separation of church and state, universal suffrage, and the power to alter or abolish one's government made him the scourge of 2 continents. His political writings both vaulted him to the height of popularity and lowered him into the deepest valley of disgrace. Throughout his life, Paine thought and lived by the conviction that being candid was more important than being popular. I am so looking forward to my guest teaching me more about Thomas Paine. And you know what? I love people that are passionate about their subjects. And Dave Benner is absolutely passionate about this. And he's going to teach all of us to love Thomas Paine and his story just as much as he did. Dave, welcome to the channel. I'm so glad you're here.
Thanks, Carlin. This is a true pleasure. And I just want to say, you have an extremist book club. Well, Thomas Paine's works would have been in any 18th century extremist book club. So,
oh, excellent. Well, maybe we'll read your book for book club next, Dave. Who knows? But tell us, why did you decide to tackle this topic of Thomas Paine?
yeah, it's a combination of reasons. So I'll just give the 2 biggest ones. Is one, not much of substance has been written on Paine for a long time. Paine does have many biographers, but none of the noteworthy ones have really been written for several decades. And the ones that do exist kind of gloss over some things. I think they omit some key details, and they really, in my mind, most of them don't really explore the depths of his convictions and actual positions on the issues so much as, what he did. For instance, the rights of man and the age of reason have not been very well explored by most Paine historians. And, I wanted to do that. The second is that, there's a piece of Paine, I think, that every American will love, and a piece of Paine that every American will despise. And I say that because, there's things about libertarianism that would not totally conform with some of Paine's ideas. Same with Democrats and same with Republicans and their dispositions and things. So I think that there's a piece of Paine that almost all of the American psyche wants to claim for their own. And I thought that was interesting. And even some of Paine's opponents really understood the impact that he had on his time. For instance, John Adams, who did not particularly like Paine, said the same. And then he begrudgingly said, call it then the age of Paine, realizing this. So just an important figure that had a hand in rocking the political establishments of America, England, and France, very uniquely so, like no other founder.
Well, and he came from pretty lowly beginnings, didn't he?
He did. He was born in a town called Thetford on the east coast of England, born to kind of a commoner tradesman father that owned a stay making company. So what stays were they were the structural kind of underpinnings of a corset, of a woman's corset. So his
Oh
political
my.
rivals actually made fun of him for this at parts of his life. He was taught in grammar school there. For most of his youth, he bounced between many different professions, at one point trying to follow in his father's footsteps, but also as a tax collector, believe it or not. And he
That's
also
not
was a
very libertarian.
that's not that's pretty anathematic to libertarianism. He also was a privateer, essentially a pirate of sorts
Pirate.
that plundered French vessels under kind of the ostensible authority of the English government, but really it was mostly a private venture. So he did many things before he came to the United States. But yeah, he was a commoner, and it's significant that you asked that too, Carlin, because most of the founding fathers that we think of and conceive of were essentially aristocrats. They were American aristocrats with lots of money, wealth, prestige. Paine was none of those things, and some of that actually served to his advantage when he got into his writings.
Do you think that's why maybe he was a little bit more candid than some of the other founding fathers, and maybe a little bit more inclined to be forthright with what he thought about things? He wasn't playing politics like they were?
100%. He spoke like people today would at a construction site, like construction workers. All of his writings were penned in a style that were called vulgarity at the time, and it's not
Oh, I
to
love it.
mean it wasn't to mean profane, but it was meant to be like a more colloquial, friendly type of speech that connected with common people. Because what he did was he essentially took an aristocratic struggle between, American aristocrats and Parliament and turned it into a digestible thing that commoners could understand why their liberties were being violated. So, absolutely.
I mean, it's so interesting that you put it that way because I've often thought that one of the problems that we're dealing with today in regards to what the progressive left is doing to this country is that average people don't understand it, and the people who are talking about it are doing it from like this intellectual level where they're using these fancy words and they're saying, 27 words to describe a concept when really maybe a couple words could get the concept across if you just simplified it a little bit. And normal people, just like average kind of working Joes, they don't know how to connect with that. It just feels very out of their league. And so it seems almost like this is a universal problem that Paine had back in his time as
Mhm.
well.
Absolutely. And there's just before Paine, so many people were totally kind of out of kind of touch with the political process around them, but they made do in their careers and with their families and such regardless. But Paine actually brought politics to the common person really for the first time in America.
Is that why Common Sense had such an impact and was one of like the key pieces of literature that kind of sparked the revolution?
Absolutely. It absolutely was. It was written deliberately for that. And even some of like the American founding father patriarchs of the time, people like George Washington, Charles Lee, who's not as well known, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, etc., like recognized this about the writing. Like even though it was not written in a form that they were used to reading, like they were experts in the Enlightenment theorists and things like that, academic works of their times, they recognized, kind of the impact this had. It was written in a fashion that it would have seemed counterintuitive to their class, but made such an impact on commoners. Paine thought, I believe at one point, Paine claimed that it sold 500,000 copies. Keep in mind that at that time, the colonies were composed of about 2.75 million people.
Oh, wow.
I tend to discount Payne's prediction, and I think it was more close to about 100,000. But in either case, no one doubts that it was the most impactful and significant tract that called for independence, and it came out far before that idea was, you know, even to be considered. It was a totally radical tract.
He was like the original secessionist.
He called for secession. He called for secession in his time when all the political establishment around him essentially said, "What are you thinking, you ungrateful swine? You're part of, the British Empire, the greatest empire that ever lived. They just fought a war on our behalf to clear the continent of Frenchmen, the 7 Years' War, and we should be thanking them for that. So small amounts of taxes are no price to pay, and why would you rupture the stability we have?" That's what all the naysayers told him.
Hmm. Can you take me from like okay, so he lived in England. At some point, he came to America, and then at some point, he wrote this revolutionary document that whether he sold 500,000 or 100,000 was still monumentally influential in its time. How did he go from commoner in England to being one of the founding fathers?
Great question. So, like I told you before, he was probably during the longest stretch of time in his kind of early adulthood was a tax collector, an excise officer. During the course of the time he was an excise officer, he lived in a place called Lewis. Now, his first wife died in childbirth, and the child was lost as well. But he remarried to the daughter of a shop owner in Lewis named Elizabeth Olive, and the two had an amicable separation after about 3 years. At one point during the course of his time as a tax collector, he was kind of rejected from the Board of Excisemen for failing to make an inspection properly. We don't have a lot of details about why exactly this happened, but hey, I'll cheer any tax collector that goes against the crown and
He was
decides not to
subverting the
collect
system.
taxes
I love it.
from the inside. But anyways, when he was kind of unsure about how his life would unfold, he actually ended up in London for a time where, by all accounts, he networked well. He met the most informed and intelligent scientists, historians, political scientists, etc. And through the course of this, he ran into Benjamin Franklin, probably the most noteworthy and famous person in the entire world, not just Europe, not just the United States. Very famous person
And also
worldwide.
very eccentric. Very
Very
eccentric.
very unique guy. But anyway, people back then, to gain employment, especially if they were going to move somewhere, would get these letters of endorsement. We still have this today, right? It's kind of references for your employment. Well, the best person in the entire world to get one from was Benjamin Franklin. And through being linked up with Franklin, Franklin basically noticed that Paine had, a solid head on his shoulders and incredible wit. He essentially wrote the same in a note, and Paine planned to venture to the new world. We're not exactly sure why, though Paine did write in his youth that he was always interested in kind of the history of colonial Virginia. But I think Paine just wanted to start a new life. By that time, he had little writing experience, but he did have some. He was actually the author of a petition presented to Parliament on behalf of his fellow excisemen to call for better working conditions and better pay. That fell on deaf ears. Parliament essentially rejected the petition, but his fellow excisemen were like, holy crap, this guy can write. So that's when he ventured to the United States. And on that voyage was one of the first time out of 7 that I recount in the book, where he almost died an early death. He caught a serious illness en route and was forced to stay bedridden with one of Franklin's friends in Philadelphia for several weeks after that. So that's how he made the voyage. I can tell you how he started publishing next if you wish, but
Yeah, I mean, let's go for it. Yeah.
yeah, so I'll try to make this less long-winded. But soon after arriving in Philadelphia, he became the editor of one of the leading Pennsylvania newspapers at the time. It was called the Pennsylvania Magazine. The publisher was a Whig. So at that time, the Whigs essentially opposed the Tories. Tories were more traditional. You can call them more bigger government Brits at the time.
Mm.
And Whigs more believed in a classic rights tradition of, Edmund Burke and, some of the famous figures like John Locke and figures like that. So he was essentially a Whig publisher that exercised considerable editorial discretion on releasing different articles, not only about politics, but one thing that I really want to point out, because it's not often pointed out, is Paine published basically the first pamphlet that ever called for outright slave emancipation. It's called African Slavery in America. This was unheard of to publish this, but it denounced slavery in no uncertain terms. And that was particularly radical in a place that featured slavery. Philadelphia was a slave trade hub. And there is contention amongst historians over whether Paine himself did write this or not. And I tend to think he actually didn't. But in either case, I point out in the book, he deserves, some serious recognition for deciding to publish that.
Mhm.
So
So you're telling me that a privileged white man from England was one of the first people to advocate for the abolition of slavery?
not exactly privileged, but in the United States he was, and he clung to that belief throughout his life. Several times, even in his later life, he became a Francophile and very pro-French in comparison to many of his peers. But even then, he supported the Haitian Revolution, which was basically a slave uprising that was successful in the early 19th century and overthrew the French colonialists there. So he clung to that belief throughout his life.
How old was Paine at this point?
When he first moved to Philadelphia,
Yeah.
oh man, I want to say it was somewhere in his late 30s. He was born in 37, so he would have been like late 30s.
Hmm. Okay,
Actually.
okay.
He would have been at late 30s. He moved in 1774. Um, Still a relative youngin, but he published Common Sense at the beginning of 1776. He wrote that at the end of 1775.
Mhm. And so what do you think about Paine's life made him the person that wrote Common Sense?
Hmm. It's a question that many of the historians have mulled. What I will say is we know that he ran into some of his kind of radical political beliefs when it came to monarchy, the severance of church and state, slave abolition in Lewis. So Lewis was a town in England where he lived as he was an excise tax collector, where there was a place called the Headstrong Club. It was like basically a political club where people got together, talked about the latest ideas, Enlightenment philosophy, things like that. And that town had a connection back to radical English parliamentarians that essentially overthrew the monarchy in the 17th century of England. I won't get into that, but there was a brief time in which England was a republic, mostly under Cromwell, but then there was a restoration. And part of the heritage of that town and tradition roots back to then. So we think Paine discovered those ideas at that point, but we're not exactly sure, what about them was so attractive other than that it appealed to, his populist disposition that, you shouldn't have the elite privileges you have simply from being, born to a particular family, things like that.
This is kind of an aside, but I can't help, think about it as you're explaining his life and his trajectory, which is, in part of my thought process for creating the type of content I do online, whether that be YouTube or Twitter. I've thought actually a lot about the founding fathers and the fact that they just wrote so much. I mean, like whether it be in letters or in diaries or journals or like actual things that they published. And the reason that we have so much insight into kind of that time period was because they wrote a lot of stuff.
Mhm.
And even though like a lot of it's been lost, I mean, or like kind of unusable, they wrote so much that we're able to ascertain so much about what it was like to live in that time period. And I've often thought like people today, they don't really write things down or explain the full thought process or their perspectives on things.
Mm.
And so that's something that's actually been very top of mind for me as I've been creating content. It's been like I want to be able to leave something behind that historians can look at. It like and I'm not suggesting historians should study me necessarily, but like I want to leave something to say like here is what it was like to live during this crazy time period from one person's experience.
Mm.
And as you're talking about Paine going and networking and connecting with Benjamin Franklin and being involved in these like clubs in England, it's like these little connections that people don't even think of when it's happening. It's like you go to a club, you meet some people. Like everyone has that type of experience, but that type of experience can actually become pivotal to a world event later down the line if they continue to follow it through. Am I wrong about that from a historical perspective?
No, you're totally right, and unfortunately, historians have lost. Well, we in general, our whole generation has lost many of Paine's writings, but the writings we have lost is mostly his personal correspondence. There's only a few hundred, but we do have basically all of his pamphlets. But absolutely, it's you can just see like Jefferson wrote 20,000 letters, right? So just in that sample size, we can just get so much out of it. A lot of historians know a lot about like female and male relations within marriage because of the letters between John Adams and his wife.
Yeah.
That it's a really interesting thing. I do think future historians will actually comb through tweets of people in this generation, and you'll see essentially like quote tweet books about what we thought back then and things like that.
Oh, I've actually thought about that as I've been tweeting. I'm like, and actually, I've been told by people, a person specifically that I really respect. She once said to me, "Carlin, you're not writing for people right now. You're writing for people 25 years from now. They're gonna get you
Yeah.
more than the people now do." Um,
Oh, certainly.
so everyone write stuff down, write it down, document your experience. It's gonna be important. So Common Sense comes out. What is the reception to Common Sense when it was published?
Such a split reception. So at this point, the battles of Lexington and Concord had happened in Massachusetts, and basically King George had denounced the people that stood up to the redcoats there as rebels, right? So there was a difference of opinion in the colonies of what to do about this. Was it to kind of support the beleaguered peoples of Massachusetts and fight against kind of the Port Act? Britain tried to shut down their port to trade. The Massachusetts Government Act, they basically dissolved the government and made basically the entirety of it only appointed by the crown rather than elected democratically, things like that. Like, what was there to do? Were we to just disavow these ruffians from Massachusetts? And for a time, the Continental Congress kind of settled on that course. They wrote what was called the Olive Branch Petition, which essentially confirmed the legitimacy of the Protestant succession of England and the king's authority as being true, but they did try to justify the fact as to why the colonists acted in self-defense. Now, when Paine released Common Sense, it the idea of outright secession from the British government was utterly unheard of. This was basically 6 months before the Declaration of Independence. Paine is saying in that tract that not only has monarchy not suited us well in these countries, it's illegitimate. He said it was brought to this country illegitimately, and it was established in England in its first place illegitimately because it was brought there by conquest through William the Conqueror, who was a bastard Norman. So on the basis that that transpired, he basically said, well, if your idea was that England should rule the United States because of this conquest, France should rule England because the dynasty was established by a Frenchman. He also said many more things in Common Sense that were wildly before his time. For instance, that there should be a declaration of independence. He basically called it a declaration for independence, spelling out the reasons for which we had to be politically autonomous. He said even if Parliament could give the colonies adequate representation, logistically it wouldn't matter. It wouldn't matter because they couldn't respond to any of the needs of the colonists. He also said a continental charter should be written up. Now, Continental Charter essentially is saying a constitution. And at that point, there just weren't written constitutions in the world. The only written constitution in the world had basically been discarded by the English under the short-lived Republic in the mid-17th century. But Paine was saying there should be a written constitution that spells out the limitations on government. Again, this was way before his time. We take written constitutions for granted today, for better or worse. Libertarians have all sorts of different opinions on written constitutions, but Paine is really one of the people that said there should be a written constitution for the country. So after it was released, total divisive opinion. He was recognized as a hero to the Whigs that really wanted to separate from Britain. And he was called basically a crack-brained zealot for democracy by his rivals.
A
To be called
crack-brain zealot for democracy. What a great hit piece.
it's a direct quote. I mean, you think about it now, how things have changed, but it was basically like being called a racist back then to be called a Democrat, to favor democracy. So
Oh,
he
if
was
only we
called
could.
that.
Can we bring that back, please?
You should. It sparked a pamphlet war on both sides, and he published it anonymously at first, but eventually word trickled out in the subsequent months that it was in fact he that wrote it. Some people actually suspected Benjamin Franklin wrote it, but he's like, "Nah, dog, I didn't write it."
I love it. I think we need more pamphleteering, by the way. I'm actually like, I'm a big proponent for bringing back old school pamphleteering and like doing things in paper, because I just don't think digital works anymore. I think it's there's too much content and people are too, their attention spans are too short. But you give someone I mean, I've told this story. Like, the reason that I joined the Mises Caucus originally was because I went out to beer with a couple of guys and they handed me a pamphlet and I read the pamphlet, and I wasn't going to sit down and read the website, but I read the thing they put in my hand. So I think we should bring that back.
Absolutely. And just Twitter and social media seems to like psychologically, like classically train us to be, less focused on longer winded content. So I think that there's something with that, with what you're saying.
Definitely. So Common Sense comes out and he's considered a hero by some and a villain by others. How did some of the other founding fathers react to Common Sense?
Very interesting question. So it's almost in the same way. So the America's political establishment was basically split 50-50 on Paine. Almost everyone recognized like how important common sense was to really selling the case for independence to the commoner masses, so outside of the political class. But in the years after it came out, the political establishment was very divided on Paine, and was primarily because of his role in what was called the Dean Affair. Now, before the Dean Affair, Paine actually put his money where his mouth was. He actually joined the Continental Army and served in the Revolutionary War under Nathaniel Greene, famous Continental Army general. But it quickly became known to his commanders and Washington himself, who he made a friendship with, that Paine's best talents were with his pen. So whatever he could use to serve the Continental Army in a propaganda capacity was much more viable. And he did that. He wrote what was called the Crisis. It essentially glossed over all the Patriot losses and tried to rile the spirits of patriotism within people that were suffering. But here's why the political class got divided against him: the Dean Affair. So before France and the United States had gotten together and formed treaties in 1778, there was something of a proto Lend-Lease program that France and the United States engaged in. The United States sent a delegate named Silas Deane over to France to essentially work with a front company to funnel arms and money to the Patriot cause under kind of a clandestine operation. Like, this wasn't supposed to be known to any Frenchman, any subject, that they were funding the Americans before they were officially. Now, what happened in the process was Deane engaged in some financial behavior, essentially corruption, to make money and skim money off of these proceeds. It was kind of like Iran-Contra, right? During the 1980s, if you know anything about that. But this financial corruption basically bit him in the back, because Paine became aware of this as the secretary for the Committee on Foreign Affairs. He essentially worked as a civil servant for the government. And Paine essentially was a whistleblower. I call him the first American whistleblower, like Edward Snowden, that blew the top off of this corruption. He basically said, this doesn't belong in a Republican society. You have kind of someone working under the operation of a virtuous republic that's basically stealing money in your name. And when he published that, there was a split response, because some people thought that Paine doing this would blow the cover off of the relationship between the United States and France and possibly lose the revolution for us. Because if France gets wind of this, there's not going to keep giving us money. This will be an embarrassing stain to them. Other people said, well, Paine's only acting like the best Republican servant we could possibly imagine. It eventually, by a very narrow vote, led him to be ousted and essentially forced to resign from that position. So sorry, super long-winded, but that's where they ended up at, basically the end, like 1780, 1781.
Cool. And we got to have a question from the chat, and I don't know what this is, so you'll have to explain it. Any comment on his open letter to Washington would be interesting. What was
I love
that?
this question. This person's very smart. They know more about Paine than most people. So Paine established a very good friendship with Washington. Washington was called the sword of the revolution, and Paine was sometimes called the pen of the revolution. But they did develop a schism. This is because once, several years later, after what I just described, Paine left for France. He wrote a famous tract called the Rights of Man. And in the second volume, he essentially called for the utter dissolution of the English monarchy. And for this, he was basically charged with seditious libel. So under the common law, you couldn't call for this. You were basically censored. And Paine was targeted for an execution. He fled to France, and in France, he actually was known as a celebrity. He became a representative of the region of Calais because he was so popular there. And he pled for sparing the king's life. King Louis XIV, during the French Revolution, he was beheaded at the behest mostly of the Jacobins. But for this, he came under the indignation of prominent Jacobins like Saint Just and Maximilien de Robespierre, and he was actually sentenced to prison. Now, Paine in prison during the Reign of Terror, he was almost executed there, by the way. But what this person's referring to, his letter to Washington, is Paine took this personally because Washington was the president of the United States at the time. And his servant, Gouverneur Morris, the minister to France, not only didn't really do anything to try to get him out of his predicament by pressing his American citizenship, but he seemed to actually revel in the fact that Paine was being published. The Federalists by this time hated Paine. They wanted to distance themselves completely from the French Revolution and establish good relations with Great Britain. Now, again, yeah, Paine took this personally because he had established such a good friendship with Washington, and he felt personally betrayed by Washington. So he wrote this scathing letter, the first draft of which James Monroe, who was a civil servant and a friend of Paine at the time, later president, warned him not to send. He said this would only amount to basically the loss of your own reputation, Mr. Paine, if you write this. And Paine originally said that, fine, I'm not going to send it. But then he ultimately did send it. It basically called Washington a coward. It said that history would look back at him like he was a charlatan. And, for this betrayal. And he actually added the fact that he sucked as a general too, by the way. Which
So
was
this is like one of the original flame wars was between Paine and Washington, is what you're telling me. This is basically like every day on Twitter now.
every day on Twitter, but at the highest celebrity levels. Like, these are two of the most prominent people in the world. It was widely published then as a pamphlet. Paine made sure to actually publish this publicly too. We don't really know what Washington only referred to this letter once, and he never responded to the individual charges. So we don't really know what his thoughts on it were, other than he mostly ignored it. But he never talked to Washington again throughout the rest of his life. Very sad, kind of disappointing schism into the most prominent people of their time.
So anytime we're talking about like a flame war, I think that some people might think that, there were hotheads involved in this, whereas, I guess my question is, do you think Paine was a hothead, or do you think he was measured in what he was doing? And he may have been like a little hot-headed, but he also kind of thought it through and he knew what he was doing.
Mostly the latter. Paine, by many accounts, was indeed a hothead. He had the quality of attracting many friends for how kind of visceral and how ardent of a position he would take on a particular matter, but he also had a reputation for burning bridges. With Washington's one case, by the end of his life, Benjamin Rush, the man that encouraged him to write Common Sense in the first place, would not even speak to him because of his thoughts on religion. And Samuel Adams wrote him a scathing letter too that said, what makes you think that you're so great that you can de-Christianize the United States? So yeah,
I love that.
he burned bridges.
You know why I love that so much? I wish that someone had brought up that line specifically on the episode that Tim Pool did with Milo Yiannopoulos last week, because I just watched that yesterday on the channel, and Milo went, and this is an aside, but Milo went on this whole tirade about how America is a Christian nation and they never should have de-Christianized and all this stuff, but it seems like Thomas Paine had different ideas.
He certainly did. Now, I just want to be clear. I think both sides kind of have that debate wrong to some extent. So by far, like, the founding fathers were predominantly some kind of Protestant. There were very few Catholics back then, involved in the founding. Very few people would have called themselves openly a deist. The only other person of prominence that I can find in Paine's time in America that called himself that was Ethan Allen of the Green Mountain Boys. But Paine wrote a famous 2-volume series called The Age of Reason, which is a defense of deism that he wrote in the same kind of vulgar, direct, colloquial language that he wrote Common Sense and the Rights of Man in. He basically said, there's a single creator. He's a clockmaker creator that created the world and kind of left it to its own development. He said that basically God's glory can be seen in nature and through reason. Biblical prophecies, miracles, things like that is all superstition. He did not follow any organized sect, though he was raised as a Quaker, believe it or not. But this was just unfathomably, again, radical and novel for his time. That kind of created another reason for many people to dislike him outside of his letter to Washington.
Yeah, and actually, Decavet actually already asked about the Age of Reason. Was it in prison when he wrote that?
Great question. So first volume of the Age of Reason, he finished just prior to his arrest to be placed in prison. He gave it to a friend named Joel Barlow to publish while he was in prison. And he did write part of it in prison in Luxembourg Palace, which was converted into a prison. But he didn't have much of an opportunity to write there because it was dreary, dark. He couldn't afford candles. And he almost died of a fever in prison there. He actually was only spared because of a jailer's mistake we could get into later. But the second volume, he did write part of it there. He finished it after he got out. He initially planned to release a third volume of the Age of Reason, which never came out in its final form, though we do have those writings, but they were published under another title called Essay on Dream. So he originally planned for it to be a trilogy, but it never was.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned a couple times that Paine escaped an early death on multiple occasions. I think 7 occasions you wrote in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about each of these occasions where he escaped death?
Yeah, I'll do it very quick. So the first one I've talked to on the ship, he almost came down with, I believe, a form of dysentery and died on the way. The second case was when he basically was tried for seditious libel in England for having written The Rights of Man Part 2, specifically for its anti-monarchical positions there, that essentially was viewed as an insurrectionist, right? He fled to England before they could carry out the sentence of execution that was passed by a jury there. In France, he almost died during the French Revolution because there's an event called the Flight to Varennes. So King Louis XIV, to kind of escape his predicament of being kind of subdued by the French revolutionaries and his power kind of impeded on, fled to a place called Varennes. He was trying to get into the Austrian Netherlands, whereupon he would stage kind of, a royal counter-revolution to destroy these unruly revolutionaries. During that, the commotion in Paris that resulted ended up in a mob. And Paine went outside to see the commotion, what was going on. And he went out without his tricolor hat. It was a hat with the 3 colors of France to symbolize that you were a good Republican, right? You were not one of these royalist stooges that, we all wanted to kill. He went out there, and because he didn't have the hat, one person mistook him as a royalist, and the mob fervor actually was close to stringing him up on a pole and executed. That was a common way in which the mob actually executed people there. But a friend that spoke English kind of talked them out of that. Another case was in the French Revolution. He almost died in prison. A jailer's mistake saved his life. And what happened there was when prisoners were carried off to execution, jailers would come around to their cells and mark an X on their door to symbolize he should be picked up for that the next day. And what happened was, for whatever reason, Paine's door was left open during the day in which that was happening. So the jailer actually marked the X, but not in a position on the door that it was visible for the next morning's jailer to come and pick Paine up. And Paine survived the critical last three weeks or so, I believe, for the Thermidorian reaction to depose the Jacobins, behead Robespierre, and in time for Monroe to press his citizenship. There's a few other cases as well. In fact, one, Paine was almost shot by a rum-induced neighbor at his property in New Rochelle, New York.
It would actually, okay, can we just admit that if he had survived all of that and he ended up getting shot by a rum-induced neighbor, that would honestly be kind of a funny death. It would have been.
The neighbor took as good a shot as he could. He basically, there was a dispute amongst a former tenant of his who was renting his property in Paine, and it resulted in Yes, a rum binge by this guy. His name was Christopher Derrick. He came up to Paine's house, I believe, in 1805. Paine was very old, in his late 60s at the time. Fired directly through the window with his musket. It missed Paine. And get this, Paine didn't even press charges against him. So he basically said, if I press charges against him, this populace that already hates me for what I, write on religion, even though he would never step back from what he had written on it. He just didn't want to exacerbate, the kind of clout against him.
Mhm.
There's another case where he suffered a stroke as he was walking or climbing up to his bunk bed, in New York City in one of his final residences. And one other case earlier in his life, I'll finish with this, is that as a privateer, he was talked out of going on an expedition on the docks, almost ready to board a ship called the Terrible. This Terrible ship was a privateer commanded by, get this, Captain William Death. And
No.
he was going to go on an expedition to loot French ships. I believe the crew was about 150 people. They ran into a French frigate called the Vengeance, which promptly killed, I think, 130 of the 150 crew or something like that. And he was talked out of it by his father going in the last moment. So I think those are all 7.
Wow. So he was, I mean, it's so interesting to me because like you said, he was at every pivotal moment in the history of his time. How did that happen? Was that just like coincidence, or did he actively seek out
Mhm.
kind of like the most active scenes and and involved himself in them?
Yeah, that's an amazing question too. So I think at first it was because he wanted to play a role in convincing commoners that the cause of American independence was just. The next ventures, I don't think he had intention to get involved in until various other events set him on that course. For instance, he at one point basically said, "I'm going to retire from politics. I'm no longer going to write on philosophy and, politics and natural rights and hard money and universal suffrage or any of that anymore." And he became a bridge builder. This is another thing a lot of people don't know about Paine, is that he stood on a new frontier of engineering that was utilizing iron based bridges for the first time in history. Now, he didn't invent the iron bridge, but he might have, been as close to it as humanly imaginable, because the first iron bridge he was very impressed by, and he wanted to kind of expand the usage of that throughout Europe and the United States. So he decided to be a bridge builder. It brought him to Europe. He tried to attract moneyed financiers from both England and France. He bounced between the two a few times in the late 1780s, early 1790s. And he wasn't intending to get back into politics until that powder keg of the French Revolution blew through in 1789. He believed that kind of liberty was the common gift to mankind. It was applicable universally to all peoples on earth, and he couldn't see why this was a negative thing. And his former friend Edmund Burke wrote a scathing pamphlet called Reflections on the Revolution in France that denounced the French Revolution. Surprisingly to Paine, because Burke was a friend that essentially supported the Americans in their quest for independence. So he's saying, why in the world would this man say these things? So he wrote a tract to counter it that became The Rights of Man, hoisting himself back into the political limelight. And The Rights of Man at the time was the best-selling political treatise ever sold. It still is one of the most. And it basically made his return into politics after that point unavoidable from there.
Man. DeKalb has another question. Any insight into Paine promoting social care with his agrarian justice writings?
Yeah, I'm very impressed with the Cobb. He knows a lot about Paine. So, Agrarian Justice was written in the mid period of Paine's tenure in France. Agrarian Justice was a proto UBI supporting tract that basically called for a land assessment tax to be applied to property owners of cultivated land, because, like Locke,
He called
Paine
for a
thought,
property tax?
yes,
That
for property.
bastard.
That exactly. But let me explain. So both Paine and Locke thought that, you know, resources were given to humanity in the commons, and it was by combining your labor with those resources that led to the acquisition of private property in the first case. But where Paine diverged is he thought there was a piece of that property that still belonged to the commons even after it had been acquired by its original property owner. So what he said is that, there should be a stipend to all individuals that live in a society based on this land assessment tax that would be paid annually. Now, Andrew Yang was quick to pick up on this and actually invoked Paine during his presidential campaign and said, "Hey, don't look at me. The founding fathers supported this thing. Look at what Thomas Paine did." And he was right. Now, the idea fell on deaf ears. It wasn't incorporated until, there is now. 200 years later, there's some UBI experiments going on now. But back then, total radical idea, fell on deaf ears. No one entertained it. But I do think there's legitimacy in that UBI kind of comes from some of Paine's thoughts in germ.
Man. Well, DeKalb says, sorry to harp on it, but he's a bit of a hero of mine, and I think he's still very relevant today. I think we all appreciate your contributions today, DeKalb. And, I guess this is a great question. For someone who, lived obviously a very full and productive and influential life, what does Paine's relevance, where does Paine come into today's landscape? What should we be thinking about in terms of what he did that would be relevant today?
Yeah, so I put in my book that, many biographers kind of portray their subject as a person of their time, but Paine has to be perceived by any reasonable person as someone that far transcended his time. So in his time, basically nothing was more unheard of than the complete abolishment of monarchy, than the outright separation of church and state, than universal suffrage, than the end of slavery. And we all live in Paine's world when it comes to his ideas on all four of those things. And the other thing I'll say is how we should think about Paine today is the success of political radicalism and radical political methodology. Because Paine, despite having no electoral success almost whatsoever and relying on no, political party itself, he basically changed the hearts and minds of people simply by winning the arguments, by spreading liberty through education, by making people realize how they were being how their liberties were being infringed upon by this noble aristocratic class that was basically throwing their rights to the wayside. So I really give him credit for that. Like him or not, we live in his world, and I make that a point in the book. I do think that every piece of almost any kind of ideological disposition has a claim to Paine, like I said earlier. Just to kind of underscore that, both Reagan and Obama have cited his works in their inaugural addresses. Libertarians often point to him as, a figure that called for radicalism when in a time that it was most needed. They also kind of respect his takes on hard money. He was a hard money warrior. He said that money is money and paper is paper. All the inventions of man cannot make them otherwise. So there's lots of things to think about Paine, but those are a few.
How do you think that Paine would look back on his life with retrospect to evaluate how he did?
This is my favorite question so far. So I think in his time, Paine did not realize that in a constitutional republic, there could be an aristocratic class that rises to kind of dominate people and to seize their liberty. I think he would look back and say, some of these things I thought were a little bit short-sighted when it came to that. He thought, just abolishing the monarchy was enough, because without monarchy, you'd only have meritocracy instead of, noble privileges, noble titles, appointments to positions by way of your birth. But he would look at today's political society and see, well, even under a system that's ostensibly democratic, even though it more or less is kind of an oligarchy, you have, this political class of Pelosi's and McConnell's essentially ruling people with more power than the strongest and most ardent solitary monarchs of his time. I think that he would have realized that was a shortcoming of how he was thinking back then.
How do you think that Paine would view today's political landscape?
That's a good question. It's such a hard thing to say, because I think he would come down on many different sides of various issues. But what I am convinced of is he would be a red pill dissident. He would not have any
Oh,
trust.
yeah.
he would not have any trust in the political class, even if he was, a left-wing dissident or a right-wing dissident. I think there were pieces of Paine that could be kind of magnetized toward both. I do think that he would be red pilled in either case. He would not trust kind of the mainstream media. He wouldn't trust the people in powerful positions. He wouldn't trust mainstream narratives. And he would always go back to history for the reasons why it would be a mistake to trust them.
I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, so please feel free to tell me, like, I'm not sure, but how would Thomas Paine view Donald Trump and the rise of Donald Trump and possibly
Hmm.
even now the fall of Donald Trump as we're living in, but who knows?
Oh man, it's so hard to say. And a piece of me wants to say he really would have been attracted to Paine's populist rhetoric, that was just, mercilessly against the political establishment. But I do think he would have viewed Paine as something of a heretic for once he was in office, essentially continuing most of the policies of the people he condemned and surrounding himself with totally corrupt administrators and cabinet level officials that Paine would have despised. So I think the populist pieces of Trump and what they represented would have kind of been kind of alluring to Paine to some extent, but I don't think that he would have liked kind of the end result. Like looking back in hindsight, what Trump's presidency represented, because it was mostly theatrics and not much tangible, substantive like policy differences. And that's what Paine cared about most. He wanted to see the most radical policy changes for the benefits of the individual over the state as much as possible. I think he was short-sighted on the welfare state stuff. He actually called for a proto progressive income tax, a aid package for the wealthy and poor, some works projects, and really what was kind of a proto welfare scheme too in the end of the rights of man. But at the same time, I think it would kind of been a mixed response.
Hmm. What are some things that we should know about Paine that we haven't touched on already?
Hmm. Oh man, let's see. Um, Gosh, there's just so many. Why don't I say this is that one of the misnomers that many of Paine's previous biographies have biographers have said about him is that he died completely poor and drunk and with no friends. I don't think that's true. So number one, we do know of some times where Paine did get drunk, and in one case, it was he had a kind of drunken fight with one of his publishers over the rights to the rights of man. But he wasn't known as a rampant alcoholic in the way that some of his adversarial biographers wrote about him. There's one named James Cheetham that did not know him well and despised him, and many of kind of the tales we have about Paine being an alcoholic come from him. As far as being poor, Paine did live frugally most of his life, even though some of his tracks were wildly popular. Common Sense, he basically relinquished the trademark to and the copyright to, as well as the rights of man. So he actually didn't make that much money off of the biggest selling tracks of his time. But he did make enough to live. And here's what he deserves credit for. He lived so frugally and nearly poorly in the end of his life that he sacrificed many kind of good things that he could have had and a better kind of way of life for the Bonnevie children. Now, the Bonnevie family was one that he stayed with in France, but their three young boys came over with him in 1802 when he came back to the United States. He set up a trust for them and, relinquished a significant amount of money to them at the end of his life. That one of them became a general during the Civil War, and by all accounts, they lived comfortable lives. He didn't die friendless. He had friends till the end. His wit and intelligence were recognized the world around, even to those that didn't respect him. But he had close friends, but he wasn't tied into the political class like he was in years before. So those are a few things about Paine that I kind of try to set the record straight on.
Excellent. Melissa wants to know, what did he think about women's rights?
Paine didn't write extensively on this subject, but what he did write, we know that he was essentially a complete egalitarian, uniquely so in his time, where he thought women have all the same rights as man when it comes to property, and especially when it comes to universal suffrage. Now, it wasn't unheard of, but it was almost unheard of for people to say, well, women should have voting rights back then. One state did this, New Jersey, but kind of reversed it in 1807. But Paine, especially in Europe, this was absolutely just unfathomable. Paine thought the universal suffrage was important for a free society, and the government should not have any discriminative qualities in its mind when it comes to penalizing people simply before the fortunes of their birth. So he was unique in that respect, maybe only closely to people like Aaron Burr and some people like that. So very unique mind frame on that from him.
If people were to, I mean, I think a lot of people have heard about common sense, at least in school, or they did it one time. I don't know if that's being taught anymore, and quite frankly, it wouldn't actually surprise me if it wasn't being taught anymore. But I think most people, like, when they think of Thomas Paine, they associate him with common sense.
Hmm.
What are some of the writings that people should read if they want to get into like the more radical, like extremist part of Thomas Paine, for lack of a better term?
You're totally right about common sense. The other two are The Rights of Man and The Age of Reason. The Rights of Man is essentially his most philosophical work that gets into the nitty gritty of, you know, why people have the right to alter or abolish their government, why monarchy is evil, why it's a mistake to, tie religion into the state, things like that. The Age of Reason, well, for its radicalism, it should be mentioned too. I don't subscribe to Paine's religious views, but no one can deny that how radical that was in its time. The fourth one that I always kind of recommend to libertarians, because it just speaks to us for so many reasons today, is a tract that he wrote in 1786 called The Dissertations on the First Principles of Government. It's essentially a pretty short kind of pamphlet on a defense of sound money and monetary freedom, because at that time, it was a controversial matter. Paper bills of credit had basically caused an inflation crisis because the Continental Congress basically just printed this worthless paper money called the Continental, and that's where the phrase "not worth a Continental" comes from. At the same time, the state governments were printing bills of credit, and it just created a huge issue where currency was devalued. And we have the same with us today by thanks to the Federal Reserve. So very timely track to read.
Excellent, excellent. I don't know, Dave, what else should we talk about in terms of Thomas Paine?
Oh, I mean, Paine was many things to many people, but he was the preeminent radical of his time. Last thing I'll just say is that the term radical comes from a Latin word that means root. So to be a radical means to strike at the root of something. And Paine did that in every single way, in politics, in religion, in science, in every facet of his life. And there's a lot to take from that. We live in a time where people are just proselytizing and evangelizing that you can't make any change unless it's through the political system. And I think, to the contrary, Paine proved in his time that you can make a lot of cultural change outside of the political system. Now, I'm not saying the political system has no viability for anything. Some people do believe that. Maybe some agorists watching your show think that. But Paine proved that, making liberty a phenomenon and spreading it throughout the world is a phenomenon that crosses boundaries. I'm sorry, my camera seems to have gone out.
That's all right. We can hear you just fine. So that's okay. Oh, are we coming back? Technical difficulties. It's all right.
I'll try to get it going. I can hear you fine though.
All right. No, I mean, I think that, this is, it's fascinating to me because I hadn't even really thought about Thomas Paine in years before I found out that you were writing this book, and then got really excited to actually read it when it got released. And so, oh, you're back. Yay. And so, I've been thinking a lot about, people who have, I wouldn't say Thomas Paine has been written out of history, because he hasn't been. I just don't think he's as prominent as he probably should be, compared to some of the other founding fathers. Would you agree with that?
100% agree with that. He didn't have a direct role in many of the things he influenced, but he did have indirect roles in almost all of it. And I think he's criminally neglected when it came to changing the hearts and minds of the people. Jefferson, Hamilton, Washington, Adams get a lot more accolades for what they did politically, but he did as much or more culturally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. What is Paine's greatest kind of legacy that he left behind?
Just question authority. That's what it is. It's just questioning authority and not basically ingesting, whatever's being hurled at you by the state and corporate media, because there was a state and corporate media of his time. It was through mostly the printing press. But that's the biggest lesson we can take from him. And it wasn't just the fact that questioning leads you to basically having a better understanding of what's actually happening. It was an important mental exercise that the creator gave us the gift of having, compared to many other animals that exist. I mean, animals have it too, but for whatever reason, call it natural rights or not, we have capabilities that other animals don't.
I love that, and I also love the idea of, kind of influencing culture with kind of being an outsider in the system, and not letting that stop you that you're an outsider. And I think that that's actually highly relevant to what's going on today because, I mean, I think if we've seen anything, especially in the last week, it's that the establishment class is not going to give up power lightly. But I
Hmm.
also think that the other thing that we've seen this week is that the establishment class has absolutely no idea how to actually influence culture. I don't think many people today do know how to influence culture, if I'm honest. And so the people who really figure that out are going to win. And I think that between all the different kind of factions, as much as I hate to say it, right now the far left progressive socialists are the ones who are figuring it out, and the
Hmm.
rest of us better get up to speed and figure out what they're doing and reverse engineer it, because it's going to be the culture ultimately that drives us. How do you feel about what I just said? I don't know. I
I
just came up without the
Yeah,
top of my head.
I 100% agree with you. I think that there's few people that would dispute, like, the far left owns almost most of the major institutions,
Mhm.
academia, Hollywood, most of the corporate press, almost every realm of cultural extension of the United States. So totally correct. Paine believed in truth above all, even when it was unpopular, and even if it could have led to his death. He basically smiled in the face of death, and man, there weren't many people cut from that cloth.
God, it is hard to tell the truth when it is not popular and you're going to get backlash. And I don't think I really respected that until the last couple of years. And so, I mean, kudos to Payne for being ahead of his time, because if you've never told the truth, that unpopular truth to thousands of people, you give it a try sometime and you see how it goes.
That's right.
Well,
Yeah.
Dave, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I want to just give you the opportunity to plug not only this book, but you've also written a couple of other books. Do you want to tell us about them?
Yeah, real quick. So, Compact of the Republic, the League of States and the Constitution is my first book. I wrote that in 2014. It's basically my defense of the decentralized orientation of the American political system as it was supposed to exist. Why the founders basically subscribed to federalism and decentralization in government, and, you know, how that vision has been totally eradicated over time. The 14th Amendment and the incorporation doctrine, it's on a facet that might not be as interesting, but it plays into federalism as well. That's a kind of a shorter work, more of a pamphlet. And Thomas Paine, my new book, it's out in hardcover and paperback. You can get it at davidbenner.square.site, like you have it up there. I can personalize the books, whatever you want me to write. Just don't ask me to write like Nancy Pelosi rules, and we'll be good with that. But I can personalize it for you. And I really appreciate your audience. Thanks for the great questions. There's some people that asked really impressive questions here.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. And I would encourage everyone, guys, to get a copy of one and or all of Dave's books at Dave's website. I have pinned that to the top of the chat on YouTube. It is also in the description. And I really appreciate you coming and sharing your knowledge with us today. You're always a wonderful guest, and I always enjoy talking with you. And thank you for sharing your love of Paine with us.
Absolutely. Carlin, thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to become your friend over the last year, and your
Mhm.
show's great. I wish more people would watch it. I'll do my best to share it, and just keep up the good work.
Yeah, not the Tim Pool stuff, the other stuff that's better. All right, Dave, I'm gonna pull you off the screen and chill a little bit. I'll be right back, all right? All right, guys. Everyone, please mount that like button if you appreciate Dave taking the time to spend some time with us today. And I do just want to remind everyone that that Nothing Remotely Controversial will be live a little early tonight. I'm thinking I put it 9 p.m. for pregame. I might go live a little bit before that because I want to get set up for the big the best announcement in the history of announcements, the maybe I'm running for president announcement, but maybe I'm just going to make up something else to have an announcement about because the Republican Party has successfully convinced me to shift gears. We'll see. Joshua has always said, and Joshua has been very consistent about this, that he does not think Trump is running or that something big is going to get in the way of Trump running. And he's been consistent about this for months and months and months and months and months. But Joshua did get some questions wrong last week about the election, and don't think we're not going to take him to task tonight about that. So we'll see. We'll see how Joshua's psychic skills hold up, but I will be starting Nothing Remotely Controversial probably like 8:45, 8:50-ish tonight. It'll just be a pre-game with me for the first part. We will watch Donald Trump's announcement together, and then Joshua is going to join us at 9:30, and we're going to have a special post-election recap edition of Nothing Remotely Controversial, where we will be taking your questions as well. It's always a fun show. Even if you don't believe in psychics, guys, I swear you don't have to believe in psychics to enjoy Nothing Remotely Controversial and enjoy Joshua, because just a nice lighthearted look at the news. We have a ton of fun, and I hope you'll join us tonight if you have not seen it before. And I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow at 5 p.m., Joseph Forcato is returning to the channel. He is an amazing Republican strategist, really nuanced, really down to earth. And you know what I love about Joseph? You see, he's a little bit of a troublemaker sometimes. Last time Joseph was on the show, he was singing the virtues of Margaret Sanger, and don't think he didn't piss off a couple people with that. But he made a really reasoned argument for it, and I think that there is actually some there that there's more to Margaret Sanger than people may think. And so please join us at 5 p.m. tomorrow, and Joseph and I are going to pick apart what happened with the Republicans losing the midterms, because unlike what Tim Pool says, I will actually be honest with you and tell you what happened, which is that they got their asses handed to them, and we all know it. And we're going to talk about why tomorrow with Joseph. Really looking forward to that. All right, guys, that's all I've got for right now. I'm headed out for the moment to go take a little break. Mount that like button on the way out the door. Please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, and I will see you soon. Bye, guys. See you.